The numbers keep getting bigger, but it's the same story. Duplication and overlap in federal programs waste billions. In its latest annual report, the Government Accountability Office finds 112 ways Congress and agencies could reduce redundancy. Here with the latest details, the GAO's Director of Strategic Issues, Jessica Lucas-Judy. Jessica, good to have you back.
Great to be here, Tom.
And I think it's fair to say that the immediate assumption that one has when this report comes out every year is that it's totally ignored is not the case. You point out that Congress actually has taken action to the tune of a lot of money on these particular findings that you've been doing for 14 years.
Absolutely. I mean, in those 14 years, we've identified more than 2,000 recommendations for Congress and for federal agencies. And so far, about 2/3 of them have been fully implemented and others have been partially addressed. And we've gotten $667 billion so far in financial benefits to the government for that.
Yeah, so that's approaching, let's put it another way, 2/3 of $1 trillion.
Exactly.
All right. And this year, there's new matters. In other words, the opportunities or the potential for duplication and inefficiency, because this is not just a duplication report, but an inefficiency report also. It's kind of like the sun. It's always generating new mass coronal ejections, even though the old ones dissipate.
Right. So we have some of the new areas that we highlighted this year. There's several in the tax area. So there are things that the IRS and that Congress could help the IRS do to improve its audits for certain targeted groups, like the high income, high wealth groups. They're using a new model to select for auditing, and we made some recommendations for improvement there. Or in audits of large complex partnerships, one of the things that we've recommended is the IRS actually define what it means by large complex partnerships to be able to know how effective its audits actually are. And we think that there's the potential for large savings there.
And of course, the Defense Department is always ripe for ways to streamline and reorganize and so forth. And one of the top of your list was the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency.
Right. So that one is related to its working capital fund. And we made recommendations that it adjusts the way that it calculates the amount of the cash balance in that fund to make sure that it's got cash reserves that are appropriate to the expenses of the program. And that could save the agencies that use that program potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in reduced prices.
And how do you come up with a figure like that, the estimate of savings?
The estimates that we present in the report, where possible, if it's something that, for example, if there's a bill out there that's been introduced, we'll look to the Congressional Budget Office to see if it's been scored, if there's an estimate of the savings. Sometimes the agencies themselves have estimates in their budget justification or others. Sometimes it's just sort of like, well, okay, here's the total amount that's currently being spent in this area. And if there's even a 1% improvement, the resulting savings would be, in some cases, millions of dollars to hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's a lot of different sources that we use to generate those estimates.
And some of these are, in the hundreds of millions or tens of millions, but then you have 10-year savings that you've identified that are hundreds of billions. Well, there's one especially, the Medicare payments by place of service, which sounds arcane. What is the recommendation there?
The recommendation there is for Congress to equalize the payments for Medicare, for certain Medicare services. Right now, there's a difference in how Medicare pays for them, whether it's in an office versus an outpatient facility. And equalizing those payments could result, according to CBO estimates, in $141 billion in savings over 10 years.
Well, just a detail on that one. Do all those places have the same cost basis for what they charge?
That I'm not familiar with, but again, here we're going with CBO's estimate, and the agency also, CMS has supported this as well.
Sure. We're speaking with Jessica Lucas-Judy, Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office. And in general, how do the opportunities that you present in the report come to GAO? It sounds like a lot of agencies generate even their own ideas. It's not all from audits.
Right. So all the things that we report in this annual report on fragmentation, overlap, duplication, and cost savings come from the audits that we do throughout the year. And we'll look for opportunities to make programs more efficient or more effective, look for ways that agencies could collaborate better, maybe communicate, clarify roles and responsibilities, who's supposed to do what are the goals that they're trying to achieve, and make sure that everyone is on the same page and make recommendations to the agencies, or if there's a legislative change need, we'll make a recommendation to Congress. And so this report, this annual report, compiles all of those recommendations into one place that also allows us to track over time progress in implementing those recommendations and any savings that we can estimate from those.
And in that area of fragmentation, overlap, and duplication, that's always the most exciting. I think President Obama pointed out that 3 different agencies deal with salmon or something at one time. I'm not sure that ever got fixed or not. But what are some of the fragmentation or the opposite of that, duplication efforts that you've identified? What are some of the top ones this year?
Well, generally, fragmentation is where you have more than one agency that are working together in sort of a related area. Overlap is when they might be serving similar beneficiaries or doing similar services, and then duplication is where they're doing the same thing for the same people. One thing I want to emphasize, that's not necessarily bad. Sometimes you need some redundancy in there, or it takes multiple agencies working from different angles for different audiences, slightly different needs, because they're trying to address big, complex problems, and it requires a lot of coordination and collaboration. So a lot of the recommendations that we make are where agencies maybe are working together, but they're not necessarily following all the GAO has previously identified 8 leading practices for collaboration and effective collaboration among agencies. And so they might be addressing some of those, but maybe there's others that they could do better. So I mentioned before, the idea of clarifying roles and responsibilities. You also want to know who's in charge and who's responsible for what. You want to have an idea of what the goals are that you're trying to achieve. Sometimes you need for shared language, that you might have something that sounds on its face like it's pretty obvious, but then when you get down in the weeds, you find out that they're actually talking about 2 different things, and that makes it very difficult to be able to share ideas. And so we had some recommendations this year around improving collaboration in things like federal autism research and federal dietary guidelines, and trying to track the effectiveness of anti-child trafficking efforts. So a lot of these, sort of, again, very big, complex things. And they just needed a better shared idea, shared understanding of what the goals are, and make sure all of that's documented well, too.
Right, and then there are those items that involve industry, such as federal agency software licenses. This is always a fragmentation problem because the vendors like it that way because they do better if it's fragmented and not one big license for the same thing for every agency that's using it.
But it can also be helpful, too, to have some of that fragmentation, but to have some consistency so that industry partners are not having to do it one way for one agency and then do a completely new set of documentation or a new set of things, learn things differently to work with another agency. You want it to be sort of consistent. One of the areas that we highlighted this time was on the background investigations and security clearances. One of the problems there is there's supposed to be reciprocity. There's supposed to be some recognition if you get a clearance, and this could go for contractors as well as federal agencies. If you get a clearance or a background investigation for one, it should be good for another agency, but the agencies we found didn't necessarily trust each other, didn't necessarily trust their processes, and again, also didn't necessarily have access to the data systems to be able to check the background investigations or to see if there was any period where somebody wasn't covered. And so we made recommendations that the agencies work together better to try to overcome some of those challenges.
Sure. I call that one FedRAMP for people, you might say. And
right.
Did the FedRAMP program itself make it in there? Because that's sometimes where even though someone is certified, the other agency won't accept it, and they make the contractor and the agency go through hoops to recertify the same vendor.
Right. I know FedRAMP has been something that GAO has been tracking for a long time and made a number of recommendations in that area.
All right. So 112, and then there are some things agencies can do on their own, some things Congress has to do.
Exactly. So Congress so far has, we still have about a little more than half of the recommendations to Congress are still open. We've been trying to track the bills that have been introduced that would help to address some of the areas that we've made in the past. There's also some where we've made recommendations to agencies over the years and haven't necessarily seen progress. And so now we come back and make a recommendation to Congress. Hey, Congress, please require this agency to do this. And one of the tax areas was one back in 2007, I think we had made a recommendation that IRS needed to have a strategy for addressing the tax gap, the difference between the taxes owed and the taxes that are paid voluntarily for sole proprietors. Those are individuals, non-incorporated businesses, and that can include gig workers as well as social media influencers, drivers for different systems and things like that might not even necessarily know that they are sole proprietors. It's not a term that many people are all that familiar with, and so don't necessarily know what their tax obligations